The American Yawp, Chapter 11, Growth and Conflict, Section 1, Introduction. The final years of the 1830s and the coming decade of the 1840s were a time of drastic, sudden, and reality-bending change for most Americans. The emergence of a cash-based economy, the harnessing of steam power, and the growth and increasing connection of the nation's cities spawned cultural, social, and political transformations. Families changed, inspired in part by an age of moral reform. The new Democratic Party led the way into the West, emboldened by both political victories and a vision of the nation as a divinely ordained continental force. The opposition party of the Whigs largely shared this vision of the American empire, yet deep divisions loomed. These changes in national politics, urban industry, and local domestic life combined to feed a bold new national imagination taking form across the nation, but especially in the West. Most white Americans believed that the United States had a divine obligation to expand its empire of liberty into the land beyond the Mississippi River. This belief proved disastrous for the indigenous people, who still controlled most of this land. In the end, this expansion and the reform, renewal, and renegotiation unknowingly led the country closer to war with itself, introducing, for the first time in clear and present terms, the problems of a national future split in two. Section 2, Connecting Cities and Goods in a Growing Nation. The transportation and communication revolutions reshaped the lives of Americans in both urban and rural places. Farmers who previously produced crops mostly for their own families now turned to the market. They now sold and earned cash for what they had previously consumed themselves, and they now purchased the goods they had once made, bartered for with neighbors, or simply gone without. Market-based farmers soon accessed credit through Eastern banks, which provided them with the opportunity to expand their enterprise, but also left them exposed to new risks of catastrophic failure wrought by distant market forces. In the Northeast and Midwest, where farm labor was ever in short supply, ambitious farmers invested in new technologies that promised to increase the productivity of the limited workforce. The years between 1815 and 1850 witnessed an explosion of patents on agricultural technologies. The most famous of these, perhaps, was Cyrus McCormick's horse-drawn mechanical reaper, which partially mechanized wheat harvesting, and John Deere's steel-bladed plow, which more easily allowed for the conversion of unbroken ground into fertile farmland. Most visibly, the market revolution encouraged the growth of cities and reshaped the lives of urban workers. In 1820, only New York had over 100,000 inhabitants. By 1850, 6 American cities met that threshold, including Chicago, which had been founded fewer than 2 decades earlier. New technology and infrastructure paved the way for such growth. The Erie Canal captured the bulk of the trade emerging from the Great Lakes region, securing New York City's position as the nation's largest and most economically important city. The steamboat turned St. Louis and Cincinnati into centers of trade, and Chicago rose as it became the railroad hub of the western Great Lakes and Great Plains regions. The geographic center of the nation shifted westward. The development of steam power and the exploitation of Pennsylvania coalfields shifted the locus of American manufacturing. By the 1830s, for instance, New England was slowly losing its competitive advantage to the West. After several decades of the transportation revolution, by 1860, Americans had laid more than 30,000 miles of railroad. The ensuing web of rail, paved roads, and canals made it much easier for farmers in the Northeast or Midwest to get their goods to urban markets. Railroad development was slower in the South, dedicated almost solely to connecting fields to ports, but the combination of rail lines and navigable rivers meant that few cotton planters struggled to transport their products to textile mills in the Northeast and Europe. Such internal improvements spread not only goods, but also information and people. The transportation revolution was accompanied by a communications revolution. The growing rail networks in the Northeast and Midwest linked urban spaces together, reducing the perceived distance between them by cutting travel times from weeks to days and days to hours. The telegraph likewise redefined the limits of human communication. By 1843, Samuel Morse had persuaded Congress to fund a 40-mile telegraph line stretching from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore. Within a few short years, telegraph lines would carry news of battles in the Mexican-American War to Eastern newspapers within just a few days. Meanwhile, the cash economy eclipsed older, local, informal systems of barter and trade, first in urban centers and then increasingly in rural spaces. Income and its consistency became the measure of economic worth and social privileges. Young workers might earn and expect wages as employees, rather than room, board, and training, as part of a system of apprenticeships meant to propel rather than enrich. Moreover, a new form of economic organization appeared, the business corporation. Rooted in the idea that labor and laborers were a single part of a larger system of production, corporations offered the nation's first top-down experiment in collective, profit-driven, integrated capitalism. Importantly, unlike the equally capitalistic and profit-driven system of racial slavery in the South, The developing corporate system in the urban North created a hierarchy of wage earners, foremen, managers, and executives, couched in the language of democracy and economic voluntarism. The cotton boom fueled speculation in and dedication to slavery across the South. New technologies in tool manufacturing, such as steel plows, steam-powered cotton gins, and mechanical reapers, were nothing short of revolutionary and increased crop outputs over the 1830s and 1840s. Although more expensive to purchase, these products lasted longer and allowed for a massive repurposing of both labor and land, especially on large southern plantations. Tilling fields and planting crops became faster and easier, as did harvesting and deseeding, increasing profits and leading to reinvestment at nearly every level of the southern agricultural system. Increased global demand for cotton likewise led many enslavers to leverage potential profits into loans used to purchase ever-increasing numbers of enslaved laborers. For example, one 1840 Louisiana Courier ad warned that it is very difficult now to find persons willing to buy slaves from Mississippi or Alabama on account of the fears entertained that such property may be already mortgaged to the banks of the above-named states. This created a curious relationship between the northern and southern economies, as much of the money received from these loans flowed from northern and southern banks. While cities in the north and border states became increasingly dedicated to the mass production, movement, and sale of finished goods, the financial sector it fueled was ever more tied to the southern slave economy. Buttressed by investments in trade and budding industry, northern banks and lenders saw the southern slave market as a valuable way to invest in the production of raw materials, which in turn theoretically drove industrial production in the north, without the moral weight of direct investment in plantations and slavery itself. Instead of buying up land, slaves, and plantations of their own, northern investors simply provided mortgages and loans, with which southern plantation owners and enslavers expanded their operations and increased their own investments in enslaved workers. By the beginning of the 1850s, and certainly by the end of that decade, cotton fueled much of the American economy, picked by the hands of enslaved black workers in the southern states, and funded, finished, and shipped by investors, banks, factories, and corporations in cities across the north, south, and west. It was transported on rail lines, boxcars, paved roads, and steamships, through human-made canals and massive rivers, all of which made a vast, diverse, and once truly disconnected nation seem much smaller than it ever had before. Section 3. Industry and Society. The emerging industrial economy of the 1830s and 1840s gave rise to a number of, as yet unimagined problems. Family life changed, defined by shifting meanings in individual value, collective labor, and the relationship between work, class, and politics. Men, women, and children took on new roles in the home, as well as in the factory. In the public sphere, women increasingly challenged the moral direction of this new American society. Femininity in the nation was intimately tied to the domestic sphere in what historians have described as the cult of domesticity, or the cult of true womanhood. These ideas developed in tandem with industrialization, the market revolution, and the Second Great Awakening. In reality, they applied primarily to upper-class and middle-upper-class women. Working-class women joined the public sphere through their labor, which was necessary for their family's survival. In the era of revivalism and reform, Americans understood the family and home as the hearthstones of civic virtue and moral influence. Women, the dominant understanding of gender claimed, were expected to be the guardians of virtue and the spiritual heads of the home. They were to be pious, pure, submissive, and domestic. Their responsibility was to pass these virtues on to their children. The Southern emphasis on honor affected women as well. While Southern men worked to maintain their sense of masculinity, so too Southern women cultivated a sense of femininity. Yet women took the very ideology that defined their place in the home and used it to fashion a public role for themselves. As a result, women became more visible and active in the public sphere than ever before. The influence of the Second Great Awakening, coupled with new educational opportunities available to girls and young women, enabled white middle-class women, especially in the North, to leave their homes en masse, joining and forming societies dedicated to everything from literary interests to the anti-slavery movement. Northern working-class women joined the public arena too, but in a different way. Young women workers organized strikes, including one at the Lowell textile mill in Massachusetts. Later, they created the Lowell Female Labor Reform Association, entering the political arena. While some Northern women began to organize reform societies, Southern women were more often instructed to offer a calming, moralizing influence on husbands and children and manage their households. Managing the household was not easy work, however. For Southern women on large plantations, managing the household would include subduing a population of humans who often fought against the oppressions of enslavement. For most women who did not live on plantations, managing the household included nearly constant work in keeping families clean, fed, and well-behaved. On top of these duties, many women were required to help with agricultural tasks. Some women also sold eggs and butter, or took in laundry to supplement the family's income. Female virtue, particularly in the South, came to be understood largely as a euphemism for sexual purity. Culture, law, and violence largely centered on protecting the virtue of sexual purity from any possible imagined threat. In a world saturated with the sexual exploitation of black women, men developed a paranoid obsession with protecting the sexual purity of white women. Black men were presented as an insatiable sexual threat. While some sought to overturn social hierarchies, many Southerners sought to preserve them. Southern manhood was largely shaped by an obsession with masculine honor. Honor prioritized the public recognition of white masculine claims to reputation and authority. Southern men developed a code to ritualize their interactions with each other and to perform their expectations of honor. This code structured language and behavior and was designed to minimize conflict. But when conflict did arise, the code also provided rituals that would reduce the resulting violence. Racial systems of violence and domination were wielded with crushing intensity for generations, all in the name of keeping white womanhood as pure as the cotton that anchored Southern society. The formal duel exemplified the code of honor in action. If two men could not settle a dispute through the arbitration of their friends, they would duel to prove their equal honor status. Duelists arranged a secluded meeting, chose from a set of deadly weapons, and risked their lives as they clashed with swords or fired pistols at one another. Some of the most illustrious men in American history participated in a duel at some point during their lives, including President Andrew Jackson, Vice President Aaron Burr, and U.S. Senators Henry Clay and Thomas Hart Benton. In all but Burr's case, dueling helped elevate these men to prominence. Violence among the lower classes, especially those in the backcountry, involved fistfights and shootouts. Tactics included the sharpening of fingernails and filing of teeth into razor-sharp points, which would be used to gouge eyes and bite off ears and noses. In a duel, a gentleman achieved recognition by risking his life rather than killing his opponent, whereas those involved in rough-and-tumble fighting achieved victory through maiming their opponent. The legal system was partially to blame for the prevalence of violence in the Old South. Although states and territories had laws against murder, rape, and various other forms of violence, including specific laws against dueling, upper-class Southerners were rarely prosecuted, and juries often acquitted the accused. Although hundreds of duelists fought and killed one another, there is little evidence that many duelists faced prosecution. And only one, Timothy Bennett, of Belleville, Illinois, was ever executed. By contrast, prosecutors routinely sought cases against lower-class Southerners who were found guilty in greater numbers than their wealthier counterparts. These economic, religious, and social transformations increasingly seem to divide the world into the public space of work and politics and the domestic space of leisure and morality. Women's roles as guardians of moral virtue were used to address all forms of social issues that they felt contributed to the moral decline of society, including labor laws, prison reform, and anti-slavery. In spite of this apparent valuation of women's position in society, there were clear limitations. Under the terms of coverture, men gained legal control over their wives' property upon marriage, and women with children had no legal rights over their offspring. Additionally, women could not initiate divorce, make wills, sign contracts, or vote. Section 4. New Faiths. By the 1830s, the Second Great Awakening had already brought about tectonic shifts in the landscape of American religion. A newfound evangelicalism had spread a more open, reactive, and malleable form of religious zeal into the West. As a result, reformers across the nation had begun to harness that passion by organizing movements and founding churches dedicated to perfecting the American character. The self-reliance, discipline, and moral righteousness that defined the new American middle class's image of itself found fertile ground in the rural spaces and working-class towns that linked the older northeastern cities of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia with cities like Charleston, New Orleans, St. Louis, and Chicago. This produced an attitude of conscious reform and moral renegotiation that at once sought to escape and recreate the industrial, urban, middle-class outlook of the Northeast. Perhaps most notable of these new religious groups were the Mormons. In Nauvoo, a small city in eastern Illinois founded as a haven for members of the uniquely American church, Joseph Smith moved beyond the bounds of 1840s Christian orthodoxy by continuing to pronounce personal revelations and introducing sacred rites to be performed only in front of church members in Mormon temples. Entrusted by God to rebuild the kingdom of Christ in the United States, Smith claimed, he and his followers were unrestricted in their criticism of modern society and its need for reform. Most controversially, Smith and a select group of his most loyal followers started to challenge standard notions of domesticity in marriage and began taking additional wives, a practice known at the time as, quote, plural marriage. Smith himself, for example, married at least 30 women over the course of just 3 or 4 years. Although Mormons did not publicly acknowledge or openly practice polygamy until 1852, when they moved to the shores of the Great Salt Lake, rumors of Smith's involvement circulated almost immediately and played a part in the motivations of the mob that eventually murdered the Mormon prophet in the summer of 1844. The Mormon Church continued under the leadership of Brigham Young, who led the group's movement westward beginning in 1846. Mormons were not the only religious community in antebellum America to challenge the domestic norms of the era through radical sexual experiments. Shakers strictly enforced celibacy in their communes scattered throughout New England and the upper Midwest, while John Humphrey Noyes introduced free love, or complex marriage, to his Oneida community in upstate New York. Others challenged existing cultural customs in less radical ways. For individual worshipers, spiritual egalitarianism in revivals and camp meetings could break down traditional social conventions. For example, revivals generally admitted both men and women. Some preachers provided women with new opportunities to openly express themselves and participate in spiritual communities. This was particularly true in the Methodist and Baptist traditions, though by the mid-19th century, most of these opportunities would be curtailed, as these denominations attempted to move away from radical revivalism and toward the status of respectable, organized denominations. Some preachers also promoted racial integration in religious gatherings, expressing equal concern for white and black people's spiritual salvation and encouraging both enslavers and the enslaved to attend the same meetings. Historians have even suggested that the extreme physical and vocal manifestations of conversion seen at impassioned revivals and camp meetings like those seen in Pentecostal services offered the ranks of worshipers a way to enact a sort of social leveling by flouting the codes of self-restraint prescribed by upper-class elites. Although the revivals did not always live up to such progressive ideals in practice, particularly in the more conservative regions of the slaveholding South, the concept of spiritual egalitarianism nonetheless changed how Protestant Americans thought about themselves, their God, and one another. Not all American Christians, though, were taken with revivalism. The early 19th century also saw the rise of Unitarianism as a group of ministers and their followers came to reject key aspects of Orthodox Protestant belief, including the divinity of Christ. Christians in New England were particularly involved in the debates surrounding Unitarianism, as Harvard University became a hotly contested center of cultural authority between Unitarians and Trinitarians. Unitarianism had important effects on the world of reform when a group of Unitarian ministers founded the Transcendental Club in 1836. The club met for 4 years and included Ralph Waldo Emerson, Bronson Alcott, Frederick Henry Hedge, George Ripley, Orestes Brownson, James Freeman Clarke, and Theodore Parker. While initially limited to ministers or former ministers, except for the eccentric Alcott, the club quickly expanded to include numerous literary intellectuals. Among these were the author Henry David Thoreau, the proto-feminist and literary critic Margaret Fuller, and the educational reformer Elizabeth Peabody. Transcendentalism had no established creed, and this was intentional. What united the Transcendentalists was their belief in a higher spiritual principle within each person that could be trusted to discover truth, guide moral action, and inspire art. They often referred to this principle as soul, spirit, mind, or reason. Deeply influenced by British Romanticism and German idealism's celebration of individual artistic inspiration, personal spiritual experience, and aspects of human existence not easily explained by reason or logic, the Transcendentalists established an enduring legacy precisely because they developed distinctly American ideas that emphasized individualism, optimism, oneness with nature, and a modern orientation toward the future rather than the past. These themes resonated in an American 19th century, where political democracy and readily available land distinguished the United States from Europe. Ralph Waldo Emerson espoused a religious worldview wherein God, the eternal one, manifested through the special harmony between the individual soul and nature. In The American Scholar, 1837, and Self-Reliance, 1841, Emerson emphasized the utter reliability and sufficiency of the individual soul and exhorted his audience to overcome our long apprenticeship to the learning of other lands. Emerson believed that the time had come for Americans to declare their intellectual independence from Europe. Henry David Thoreau espoused a similar enthusiasm for simple living, communion with nature, and self-sufficiency. Thoreau's sense of rugged individualism, perhaps the strongest among even the Transcendentalists, also yielded Resistance to Civil Government, 1849.8. Several of the Transcendentalists also participated in communal living experiments. For example, in the mid-1840s, George Ripley and other members of the utopian Brook Farm community began to espouse Fourierism, a vision of society based on cooperative principles, as an alternative to capitalist conditions. Many of these different types of responses to the religious turmoil of the time had a similar endpoint in the embrace of voluntary associations and social reform work. During the antebellum period, many American Protestants responded to the moral anxiety of industrialization and urbanization by organizing to address specific social needs. Social problems such as intemperance, vice, and crime assumed a new and distressing scale that older solutions, such as almshouses, were not equipped to handle. These moralists grew concerned about the growing mass of urban residents who did not attend church, and who, thanks to poverty or illiteracy, did not even have access to Scripture. Voluntary benevolent societies exploded in number to tackle these issues. Led by ministers and dominated by middle-class women, voluntary societies printed and distributed Protestant tracts, taught Sunday school, distributed outdoor relief, and evangelized in both frontier towns and urban slums. These associations and their evangelical members also lent moral backing and workers to large-scale social reform projects, including the temperance movement designed to curb Americans' consumption of alcohol, the abolitionist campaign to eradicate slavery in the United States, and women's rights agitation to improve women's political and economic rights. As such wide-ranging reform projects combined with missionary zeal, evangelical Christians formed a benevolent empire that swiftly became a cornerstone of the antebellum period.